and it's time for Midweek Mediawatch. Hayden Donnell is in the studio with me.
Kia ora, Emile.
How was your summer, Hayden?
It was initially terrible and later quite good.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yes.
I'm glad to hear it.
My son had a troika of illnesses.
A troika of illnesses?
Yeah. He started off with strep butt. Did you know that you can get strep throat in your butt?
Is that right?
That's not something I'm making up, and why would I make that kind of thing up? It's a weird accusation to throw at me. Google it if you don't believe it. He also got COVID, and then he got gastro, and so it was a bit of a terrible start to things. He threw up on the floor on Christmas Day, but after that, we had some lovely holidays.
I was really just asking to be polite, but wow.
I just wanted to share that with the world.
You need to get it off your chest.
Text 2101 if your holiday was the same.
Troika as well. Lovely word. Thank you. Let's talk media, though. And you want to start this week with one of the big sources of news and debate this week, which was the hui at Ngā Ruawahia.
Yeah, Tūrangawaewae marae.
Mm-hmm.
And there was plenty of interesting opinion and coverage of the hui. And I just want to recommend one. There was Aaron Smale did a piece for Newsroom, headlined Māori Rise Up While Government Looks to Rewrite History. And it actually it imparts a lot of that history. Its level of detail is really impressive. It takes everything from tensions over the corporate structure of Tainui iwi to sections of history on the land wars. It relates that to the modern day. It puts what's happening now in the context of the past. It's really good in that sense. So I'd recommend that. But I also wanted to highlight a couple of other opinion pieces, mainly because they stirred up a bit of controversy and comment, particularly online. And one was by Mihi Forbes for RNZ, headlined The Wairua Brought Them. And another was by John Campbell for TVNZ. And that was headlined, I Saw Peace, Joy, and 10,000 People Uniting to Say No.
Yeah, and both of those pieces really seemed to focus on the optimistic, the unity and hope at the Ngā Ruawahia hui, yeah?
Yeah, and that's quite unusual because just as context, obviously, this is... There's a lot of discontent in the background here for what some at the hui described as the current government's anti-Māori or even white supremacist tendencies. More on that later. Mm-hmm. The political situation for Māori right now is described in quotes from someone else in Mihi Ngārangi Forbes' piece as a crisis. So there's real anger over stuff like decisions to disestablish the Māori Health Authority, remove Māori names from Crown agencies, and most particularly this apparent move or intention to table a bill that might redefine the treaty. And just to illustrate the strength of the feeling, and because it's a good clip, this is a typically understated soundbite from Hone Harawira talking to Te Aniwa Hurihanganui on One News.
The message from the masses was clear. The Treaty of Waitangi is under threat.
Well, smashed and dare they think that they can, take the treaty apart. Nobody's ever been able to do it before, and these bastards won't be able to do it now.
Yeah, so not exactly pulling his punches there, Mr. Harawira. But both of Mihi Ngārangi Forbes and John Campbell's pieces, they're really surprisingly almost buoyant in tone in a way. Both writers obviously inspired by this event, by what Forbes describes as it's the wairua that was present that drew people to it, or what Campbell calls through the words of Tama Iti as its vibes. So... yeah, Mihi Ngārangi Forbes, she says, the Māori culture is so alive it is exciting, and no wonder why, when there is a threat to the Māori way of life and being, Māori take affirmative action. So basically, it's an expression of joy and reaction to discontent.
Yeah, and the tone of both of those pieces took a bit of heat from on social media and from other journalists, right, who found them a bit florid and sort of airy-fairy
over the top.
Yeah.
The former editor of the Dominion, long-time Dominion Post columnist Carl Dufresne, he was maybe the most, vehement in response. He called Campbell's failure he accused John Campbell in particular of a failure of objectivity and impartiality in a blog titled The John Campbell Question. I thought it was a funny headline. How do we address the John Campbell question?
The John Campbell
question. It's vexed people for generations.
Exactly.
Anyway,
what's your policy?
what are you in the next leaders' debate? We're going to go to the John Campbell question now. Anyway, he called for John Campbell's brutal, decisive and very public sacking. That's a direct quote. Said the government couldn't brook what he called one of its employees at what he also called its most potent communications medium, being so determined to undermine its agenda. Now, I take real issue with the idea that someone at TVNZ is a government employee, at least not directly. Independence there is baked into its charter, as it is at RNZ. I also really object to the idea that TVNZ is a government communications medium.
The government's the word there.
Well, I'm sure they would object to that there at TVNZ. Like that, this isn't North Korea. This isn't state media. There's independence there, and freedom to criticise the government is one of its most fundamental qualities. But I guess most pertinently, what Carl Dufresne seems to have missed or disregarded is the word opinion in capital letters at the top of John Campbell's piece.
That's an interesting point, because is the thing, do you think maybe that John Campbell is a well-known newsman and has made his name as a reporter and a presenter of what you would describe as sort of strive for the ideal of objective journalism, and the idea, I suppose, the philosophy that a good newsman shouldn't be writing opinion piece, strident opinion piece. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is an opinion piece, so it shouldn't really be a crime that it contains opinion. It's clearly labelled as an opinion piece, but you're right. There's this wider tension here. Is it wrong for journalists to be expressing opinions, particularly when they're also charged with doing straight news coverage and objective reporting? And look, sometimes I do like to try and get myself into project other situations into the future, have empathy with other people, know their minds, and if I see things from different people's point of view. I guess I can see if this was a different situation and it was a prominent TVNZ columnist who was sharply critical of a right or of a left-wing government, then maybe there would be calls from the left for this sacking or outcry from the left over the bias as well. But look, I kind of think that these restrictions are unsustainable. I just don't think that it's really feasible to expect journalists to make their minds just a placid pool of pure neutrality and to never express an opinion. I think a more sustainable and honest approach would be to be willing to criticise, to express an opinion, to have an opinion, but be willing to be a fair broker, to call balls and strikes, to use an Americanism, or to use something that you might be more familiar with, to call out a black cap LBW.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, that was one. I know what you mean.
Do you get that now? Like,
yeah, I do.
If you were umpire, and,
I understand your sporting metaphor now. Yeah.
Yeah, Devon Conway. Yeah.
So what you're suggesting that it's not necessarily you can't insist that people don't have opinions.
Well, it's kind of silly, isn't it? I mean,
of course,
we do
opinions are like...
there are some journalists who try to do that, like Peter Baker at the New York Times. He says that he almost tries to empty his mind of any thoughts that might be biased, or he doesn't even express opinions around the dinner table at home. I just don't think that that's feasible. If you say that journalists can't express the opinion on paper, that doesn't mean that they don't have it in their head.
But isn't that the skill set of the journalist, to have their opinion and to hold and accept that they have their opinion, but to strive for the ideal of objectivity? Or are you scathing of the idea of objectivity in and of itself?
No, I think that is absolutely correct. What you have to do is hold your opinion and be a fair broker. And I think John Campbell has shown that in the past. He's painted Labour in particular as insipid, milquetoast, cowardly in recent opinion columns. I'd say he's also been quite critical of the Greens, maybe not recently, but he was one of the leaders when it came to the Matiria Ture story. He prosecuted that very harshly. I don't know if people remember that. And look, I'm not going to sit here and I don't know his politics or anything like that, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you that John Campbell's right wing. But I don't think it's really feasible to expect them to never have an opinion, but rather to be willing to criticise everyone. It's less don't have an opinion, more don't be a stooge. And if And then it's up to them to make sure that their reporting, their objective reporting, the neutral reporting is actually fair to everyone involved, and it fairly takes in all of the views that are on offer. And editors, I think, have a responsibility here to step in if they feel that a journalist is being a stooge.
These were not the only issues of balance that the media had to address with its coverage of that particular hui, and also more recently Ratana, Hayden.
Yeah, I thought just on this, Te Pāti Māori co-leader Debbie Ngāti-Wapaka had a really interesting interview on Morning Report this week, and it was trotting along nicely until she said this.
I think what's more important is that the continual growth and leadership of our people finds us aligning with ourselves again, in particular in this time and era when we have a government that is so anti-Māori and displaying all the traits of typical white supremacists.
Huh.
So that was that was a term that she used, and that came about 2 minutes into a 6-minute 30 interview. And suffice to say, Ratana wasn't mentioned again. Corin Dan clearly felt that he couldn't let that statement pass without pushback. The entire rest of the interview was devoted to her use of the phrase traits of typical white supremacists. So I'm just going to play one clip as an example of an exchange there.
Are you proposing that 10,000 people mobilised for nothing and there was nothing that we had to talk about?
Not at all. Not at all. But I'm just arguing back from their perspective that they have a differing view, but that they would be, offended by the suggestion that somehow that their policies are being driven on the basis of racial superiority.
So that was just an example. Corin Dan later went on to say, look, it's just my job to challenge you on this, and the whole rest of the interview was about
It was about that phrase, was it?
Yes, and they clearly decided that balance needed to be provided on the spot right there.
I sympathise with Corin there because it's a live interview, and when such a big... the news line after that interview is going to be the phrase white supremacy or traits of typical white supremacists, and he clearly felt like that was something that he just couldn't let slide, right?
I was interested in your perspective of it as someone that actually does these live interviews. Would you just stop the interview there? Because you can't let it go. You can hear the headline go off, right?
Yeah,
you're like, well, this is what I have to address right now, and maybe you get criticism if you didn't address that. Is it right to do it in quite a confrontational way, though? Or would it have been better? I wondered, the only thing that I thought is, would it have been better? I'm trying to do Corin Dan's job for me. He's better at his job than me. Would it have been better to just say, hey, you've just said this, please explain. What do you actually mean by it?
Right, yeah.
Because it seemed like she was talking about systemic, not that these are people that are wearing white hoods and burning crosses on the hill, but really systemic Pākehā dominant modes of thinking in the government, and asserting Pākehā dominance through the government in systemic ways rather than that kind of thing. Yeah,
it's a tricky situation to be in, isn't it? Because I suppose the point of the interview is not to get into a discussion of that, whether this is the behaviour of typical white supremacists. There was clearly a narrative for the interview to go through, and yet when something like that happens, it's almost like an emergency kind of situation. Oh my goodness, this person actually said this. We're expected, on behalf of people who are politically opposed to them, to demand an explanation.
But does that take up the next 4 minutes of the your audience? I wonder whether you're hearing your audience here, which is, let's face it, predominantly Pākehā, predominantly older, recoiling at that term, which might not be so controversial to other segments of society that might not make up Morning Report's audience. Look, is it in a way the fact that term is so shocking?
It's a shocking term, isn't it? Exactly.
Yeah,
it makes you sit up and take notice. Yeah.
Is that Pākehā bias in a way? I'm just thinking on the spot.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and I suppose it gets in as well to the idea that or the question of these are politicians that we're talking about. I don't know what's in Te Ngāti-Wapaka's mind, but politicians often come with quite sophisticated plans as to what they are going to say, and you can redirect an interview with a sensational turn of phrase as well. I don't know whether that might have... Has that idea crossed your mind in terms of this?
Oh, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it as a pre-planned sort of thing like that. No, I hadn't. I don't know if it was.
I don't know whether it was either. That just occurred to me on the
yeah,
spot.
I wondered where you draw the line. Anyway, we're running out of time.
We are. Let's move on, because one of the big media stories over the past, certainly of the past 6 months or so, is Golriz Gharahman and these shoplifting allegations. And there has been a lot of criticism of the media as to how it handled these allegations. Some right-leaning figures saying the media underplayed the situation. Some of the left saying it received blanket, almost gleeful coverage. What did you make of this?
Look, I saw criticism of this, as you say, from both sides. I didn't think that the level of coverage was underplayed or overplayed. I thought the media, it's always going to be a huge story if a sizable political party's justice spokesperson is caught shoplifting. So on the face of it, that's just going to be a huge story. There's just no way around that. There have been things raised, though, that I do think are much more sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to the idea that there are systemic issues with how politicians like Golriz Gharahman are treated in the media, but particularly on social media, that they're driven to great lengths and perhaps put under huge pressure by the abuse that they receive. And we've seen Simon Wilson writing about that in the Herald, that he mentioned, of course, you sometimes forget that James Shaw was bashed,
punched to the face
at a bus stop in 2019. I feel like we underplay that sometimes, but that person was, I think, chanting some conspiracy adjacent stuff at the time. And so there's reason to be fearful in some ways, and maybe that can provoke a strange response in some people. And I think this is a pernicious and long-term issue facing.
Do you think that the social media element is the most, is the biggest point? I guess what I'm saying is, maybe previously these vicious, vitriolic, venomous things were the sorts of things that people might say to each other at a pub, or on the phone, or in passing when you're talking politics with your mates or something like that, and it would be uttered, and some people might laugh, and then it would fly into the ether and be lost forever. But now with social media, anyone can write whatever they like. They can often direct their message to the person that it's meant to be aimed at.
And they can build one on the other.
Exactly.
And so it takes on a different character. This is exactly the same mechanism is to what free speech campaigners always complain about, which is called cancellation, which is just social media mobs disagreeing with you en masse, right? But it's almost worse than that, because cancellation was often counter-speech, argument, condemnation of a point of view. This is just abuse. And it comes one after the other. And I've seen people retreat from public life, and I've seen people act out of character. You can see that how it would make you act out of character if you're under that kind of pressure. And I see mostly women retreating from public life and public roles because of this, even if it's just a locked Twitter account, or sometimes stepping down from public-facing events out of fear. I think this is a pernicious freedom of speech issue, and it does affect people like Golriz Gharahman, but it also affects female journalists, black and brown journalists, public figures, that kind of thing.
I guess this is where there's sort of a confluence with the mental health, what you might describe as the mental health argument. Like, Golriz Gharahman cited mental health issues to explain her actions. Maybe explain is not quite the right word, but you know what I mean there. As some politicians have done in the past. What did you make of that? Because there was some criticism that this was an overused excuse.
Yeah, Andrea Vance, she was pretty scornful of politicians using mental health as cover when they get caught in a scandal. She said, these things happen to everyone. It's a cheap excuse for those with, this is a direct quote, with a casual attitude to rules that most people abide by. It undermines genuine victims, those who go through distress at some time in their life and are met with a much less forgiving reaction and an unresponsive mental health system. But maybe that's a bit scornful of politicians. I am wary because it does seem to get trotted out every time there is a political scandal.
It's one of those things, isn't it, that maybe it's something that we didn't pay attention to for a long time, and then we started to pay a lot of attention to mental health.
Yeah.
And perhaps there is a sense among some people that it's used as sort of like a get out of jail free card,
Yeah,
a
and
way
you
to
don't-
avoid scrutiny.
Yeah, now you can't ask questions because of mental health.
Yeah.
But look, to that argument, you'd have to retort, no one's gotten out of jail free.
Yeah, right.
Todd
okay.
Muller, he stepped down as national leader. He's stepped down from politics. Kitty Allen, Golriz Gharahman, they didn't get away scot-free. They're gone. They're probably not coming back to politics. Andrew Falloon, he doesn't have a career anymore. The list goes on. So, I mean, it may be a little dubious sometimes to just say, oh, my mental health is suffering as a way of getting out of things. But
Mental health is health.
it's true in a lot of cases, and it is a reason for things, and it is worse because of social media and the abuse that people get. And it's probably, even though it's tempting to see it with such cynicism, because it is such an important issue, I'd probably say better to be safe than sorry. Be less cynical and err on the side of caution there without removing the need for accountability and straight reporting.
Thank you, Hayden. That was fun.
Thanks, Emile.
Is your boy better now, out of interest?
Oh, yeah, he's great
Okay.
now. He's great now.
That's what I like to hear.